Pastor Ed here with Daily Devotions for Friday, May the 3rd, 2024. We've been talking about those two passages from last Sunday, Acts 18 and 1 Corinthians 1, the fact that there were in the Corinthian church and certainly elsewhere since, divisions and problems and people lining up behind their favorite leader, and in some cases the founding pastor or a very charismatic pastor who came afterwards, somebody like an Apollos in the early church. But then you got Peter, who was there with Jesus at the very beginning, and so you could see how that happens, but also how that's kind of missing the point, and that's what Paul was really the point he was trying to make. In recent years, I mentioned it briefly in my sermon on Sunday, there was a Willow Creek Community Church out in South Barrington, just outside of Chicago, and Saddleback Church out in California. Willow Creek Church was founded. Willow Creek Community Church was founded by a pastor by the name of Bill Hybels back in the mid '70s. Saddleback by Rick Warren around the same time, and both of them were pastors all the way up until fairly recently. So we're talking like 40 years. But I came across an article that says the tragedy of Willow Creek Community Church, or another one that says Saddleback Church backs Rick Warren's successor despite allegations. And then when I was in Ohio, living near Akron, there was kind of a local large church in the Akron, Ohio area called the Chapel. And this was a congregation that was founded in the 1930s by a pastor who stayed there about 30 years, and then he was succeeded by his son, who stayed another 20 years. Then he had another very popular pastor who was there for like 25 plus years. But it was really tough. I think from the first pastor to his son, that transition probably went pretty well because it was the pastor's son. That third pastor, his name was Newt Larson. I think, I don't know this for a fact, but I'm thinking he probably was a very talented pastor and quickly won over the loyalty and the following in the congregation. But then when he was getting ready to leave, he brought on board in about 2006 his named successor. That pastor served alongside him for 3 years, and then Newt Larson retired, and this pastor was the senior pastor there and managed to stay only 3 years. So they went through another pastoral succession, another process, and they brought another pastor in 2012. And they started a bunch of campuses. In one respect, things seemed to be going really well. But then he apparently had a lot of power and control. He fired the popular pastor at one of their campuses in Greene, Ohio, and it just set off this whole firestorm. They looked into it, and they decided that the senior pastor in charge of everything and had that kind of power, was very harsh and had a fear-based leadership. And so he had to step down, and they chose not to have him come back. And then they ultimately decided that all these campuses, they would stay linked together, but they would kind of spin off as individual churches. But it's a difficult thing. So Rick Warren, the jury's out on that succession after him being there for so many years. Bill Hybels, that transition didn't go very well. And there's a lot of situations like that. In fact, recently read an article called "The Looming Pastoral Succession Crisis and Why It's Already Bad." Part of it is that a lot of leading churches, including many of the larger churches, have been served by the same pastor for decades, in many cases who was the founding pastor. I talked about my internship congregation, how difficult it was, for a pastor who'd been there from 1939 to 1976 for the people to adjust to somebody following him. And that's what happens in a lot of times. And it's created a problem. But what has to be kept in mind is that it's not about the pastor. The mission is way bigger than the pastor. And the goal of every pastor should be to help that congregation thrive even after they're gone. Carrie Nieuwhof wrote this: "The church isn't your personal kingdom, it's God's. Steward it that way." And he talks a little bit about, these days at least, why the succession from one, especially a much beloved and long-serving pastor, to the next one is so difficult, because in some cases, not in the really large congregations, smaller ones, the pastor really can't afford to leave. And that actually happened. I didn't talk about that. But in my internship congregation in Beaumont, Texas, that faithful pastor who was there his entire ministry, 1939, 1976, the reason why they gave him the parsonage, I mentioned that in my sermon, to live in the rest of his life rent-free, was they never paid him very much. And he had nowhere else to go. And so I think he felt obligated to stay in the church and make hospital calls and do things, even though technically he wasn't the pastor, and he was kind of stepping on the toes of the new pastor. But I can sort of see his doing that because he felt so grateful for how the congregation was taking care of him in his retirement. So sometimes that's the reason. Another reason is the pastor's identity is all wrapped up in what they do, and they don't have an identity outside of being the pastor. I kind of think that in a lot of cases, it's just that a pastor can't let go. Now, we have no indication of what was happening in Corinth. My guess would be that Paul was able to let go. And we don't know anything about Apollos, but nothing to say that it was an issue for him. It was maybe more the people being unable to let go. But again, what we've been talking about and what the source of all this division is when people get identified too intensely, I guess you'd say, with one particular pastor, and it's not good for the pastor. It's not good for the congregation. It's not good for the people who do that. And it's certainly not good for the congregation to move ahead. Pastoral leadership needs to be the kind of a thing where you're able to make the transition. You're able to have succession from one pastor to the next. It's difficult. We're all going to have our favorite pastors. Al Gibson, I grew up in this congregation. He was my favorite pastor the rest of my life. But you have to recognize that other people are called to be a pastor, even at Hope Lutheran Church, even eventually called me. So those divisions, those factions, that can really cause issues in a congregation. And we see that all the way back at the very beginning with Paul. And it's still an issue today, particularly with pastoral succession. And we have to remember Paul's words, were you baptized in my name? Did I die for you? Did I save you? No, we're Christians. Or as that story I told the other day about John Wesley being disappointed about not finding any Methodists in heaven because what? The only people in heaven were Christians. Well, got one more day. I'll be back with you and we'll kind of wrap this up. Until then, take care. Have a great one. Bye-bye.